would want the very best lawyer. A few years ago, I was helping, our church was, the church I was at previously was helping this gentleman go through his own case, and we were just trying to help him out any way we could. And I remember just the discussions with that lawyer and just thinking like I hope you know what you're doing, because you want the best lawyer. And you know, if you've ever seen, now sure, TV movies don't always show real life that well sometimes, but if you have been ever seen a show or a movie where there's a trial, you know a good lawyer can change the outcome of a court hearing. A good lawyer can make all the difference. Someone who can plead your case well can make all the difference in the world. And of course, this is true in everyday life. Somebody that can plead your case, that can stick up for you, that can watch your back in everyday life can make a world of difference. Maybe it's at work where things are just going wrong, or somebody has said something against you. Having someone to stick up for you can make all the difference. At school, growing up, I know that was the case for me. My sister, actually, my older sister, would stick up for me in school. And just having someone in your corner, having someone that even if whatever was going on was your fault, having someone to say, you know what? I've got your back. And I'm going to help you get through this. There are many different ways that we can have people advocate for us. Through words, through actions. And it is a wonderful and can be a freeing experience. And last week we started looking at the lives of two slaves. Hagar, a slave for Abraham, and Onesimus, who was a slave of Philemon. And both of them, we looked at last week, ran away. And we looked at the messiness of that whole situation and what they faced. And an incredibly challenging and weighty task, God called them to return to what they had ran away from. And yet the wonderful thing, though sometimes we might physically feel alone in those situations, though they might have thought like, okay, I'm going back and I feel alone, or I am physically alone, God never calls us, never called them to do it on their own strength, to be completely alone. And so sometimes we find ourselves in these situations where we feel like we're up against this big thing, up against a person or a task. And we find ourselves longing, I wish somebody would help me out. I wish somebody would stick up for me. The first one who is always ready to hear your cry is God. And we're going to read about that as we continue in Hagar's story. So Hagar and her son Ishmael, later in time, so Hagar goes back, she gives birth to her son, calls his name is Ishmael, he is named Ishmael. And in Genesis 21, we find her and her son back with Abraham and Sarah. And they stay there for many years. At this point, we find them in Genesis 21. Ishmael is a teenager. So they have gone back, it's been at least 13 years. Actually, 14 years, because Abraham had Ishmael when he was 86 and Isaac at 100. And so Isaac has been born, and Ishmael is at least 14, probably a bit older. And yet, as time had moved on, sometimes time does not heal all wounds. Sometimes it just hides them for a little bit. And so as time moved on, old rivalries arose, but this time in a new generation, which unfortunately led to Hagar and Ishmael to be in a similar situation that we found them in last week. We're going to read Genesis 21, verses 14 to 16 to start. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. We're actually going to look at what happened right before this next week. So Abraham gives them food and water and sends them on their way. Verse 15, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bowshot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. Again, we see Hagar in a situation that can be hard for us not to sympathize with. She's a single mom trying her hardest just to survive and care for her son. She's homeless, on the run. And she gets to a point where she has absolutely nothing left to offer. No food, no water. No doubt her strength, physical strength, is depleted. No doubt her emotional strength is waning. How could you not sob in a moment like this? I've never been in a situation quite like Hagar. I've never experienced a moment so raw and painful and hopeless. I have had moments in my life where I have maybe felt similar feelings, where things just weren't going the way I wanted, or things weren't lining up, or I saw no path ahead. And I felt alone, abandoned. And even with my faith in Jesus, sometimes life feels so empty. It's a terrible, terrible feeling. And it leads to those moments where you're feeling, God, why aren't you answering? Do you hear me? Are you real? God, are you there? Where are you? Why did you allow this to happen? And while it can seem so unfair, and we might wish God to provide immediate answers, immediate provision or correction, we can also see how the pain and the problems of life point us to the reality of what our selfishness, what our brokenness leads to. See, the pain points us towards something is wrong. But God isn't uncaring. His desire is not that injustice and heartache should win. God's not setting things up He didn't create the world and just said, okay, on to the next thing, we'll let it be. The God of the cosmos, with greater love than we could ever imagine, does not leave Hagar and Ishmael to fend for themselves. Genesis 21, verses 17 to 21. God heard the boy crying. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. Again, God proves himself to Hagar as the God who hears, the God who sees her, the God who watches over those moments and is very present. And this points us to such a wonderful truth that Hagar wasn't a side character in Abraham's story. Hagar's not a side character in Abraham's story. We might read a little less about her. That doesn't make her any less important. See, we can read about these big people in Scripture, Abrahams, the Ruths, the Moseses, the Pauls, and sometimes we forget about the Hagars, the Naomis, the Zipporahs, the Onesimuses, these other people that appear in these big people stories. But Hagar's just as important as Abraham, just as meaningful, maybe with a different role to play. But God still cared about her. God still very much cares about the people whose names appear maybe once or don't appear in Scripture. See, God's desire is to be with all his people he created. But he goes about it in a way that, yes, certain people step up. Certain people he calls to do certain things. But the main character is Jesus, not Abraham. And yet through Jesus, each one of these people become more and more significant. So Hagar is just as important as Abraham, which is why God hears her cries and reaches out. Now, we can sometimes find ourselves in situations where we say, "God, why aren't you answering? Why am I not getting what Hagar got?" And don't think that means you're any less important. You're not any less important based on how he answers. There's a point where I've had to realize, and I believe we all should get to a point where we say, you know what? I am me. And I only know so much. And I'm going to bring it to God. And God, I'm going to trust you and I'm going to let you be God. I'm going to let you be God. And in this case, God answers with water, with a well. And Hagar, no doubt, is grateful to see God is listening and hearing. It's always good to have someone in your corner. Always good to have someone watching out for you, especially when things are rough. When the odds are stacked against you in those moments of uncertainty, or when life just seems chaotic. When I started as a youth pastor, I couldn't have asked for a better lead pastor. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of great pastors out there, but I had the opportunity to work under Pastor Scott. And in a situation where he could have done his best to lead the church and lead me in my role as as a youth pastor, he could have done the work at the church and then said, you figure out your own life outside the church, that's your problem, you deal with that, and I'll help you here, and we're good. But there were times when I had to figure out a new place to stay because the landlords were moving. Or when my car broke down and you're strapped for cash and you have to buy a new car or fix the old one and hope it lasts. And there were so many moments where he could have said, you know what? We'll pray for you and hope it all goes well. But he would step in. He'd say, you know what? I think I might know a place. I'm going to contact the owners and we'll see if we can help you out. Hey, you know what? I'm going to see if I can find you a reliable car, and I'm not a car guy. He's definitely more of a car guy, and he's like, I'm going to see what I can do for you. See if I can help find a solution for this. So many times where he didn't have to, he was not obligated to, but he stepped up to advocate for me in my life. And you think of finding me a place to stay. He put his reputation on the line by saying, hey, I've got a guy. And if I turned out to be a bad tenant, well, would have been wouldn't have wanted to listen to him again, would you? He put himself on the line for me. And in the character that he has, this eventually led him away from traditional pastoral role, and he's actually started an organization with a beautiful name. It's called Street Level Advocacy, where he is championing the worth of people in need on the street. People who may have had never had anyone to stick up for them. And through that, he gets to be a part of seeing God change lives. See, Hagar knew what it was like to have God advocate for her against her situation. And Onesimus, who is the other one we are looking at, knew what it was like to have an advocate too. Because as he was sent back to Philemon, as in his conversation with Paul, saying, you know what, you need to return, he didn't go back empty-handed. No doubt Onesimus was nervous, but I bet you he was ever glad to have a letter in his hand from Paul. And the letter to Philemon, originally carried by Onesimus, back to his master after running away, potentially even after stealing from his master. Some scholars think that Onesimus, when he left, may have stolen some stuff. And yet, Paul writes on behalf of Onesimus. And we're going to continue in that letter in Philemon, verses 15 to 20. And this is what Paul writes. He says, perhaps the reason he, being Onesimus, was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever. No longer as a slave, but better than a slave. As a dear brother, he is very dear to me, but even dearer to you, both as a fellow man and as a brother in the Lord. So if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. If he has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will pay it back not to mention that you owe me your very self. I do wish, brother, that I may have some benefit from you in the Lord. Refresh my heart in Christ. What words to write. If somebody was saying that about me after doing something like Onesimus did and going back to his situation, if I was in his shoes and I heard those being read, or maybe I was there when Paul was drafting it, that would really encourage me. That would make me feel like I was worth something. And Paul says, you know what's better than a worker? You know what's better than a slave? He says to Philemon, a brother. And he says, Philemon, Onesimus is now your brother. What? How could this be true? He says, Philemon, if you can look past all the wrongs that Onesimus did, if you can look to the faith that you accepted, to the Jesus who accepted you, guess what? Onesimus has accepted the same thing. He is now your brother. You know what's greater than having a slave? It's having a brother. Onesimus is now part of God's family. Isn't that amazing? And then Paul says, you think that was big? Well, Paul says something even bigger. Well, maybe. It depends on how you look at it. I think it's pretty big, if you're in Paul's shoes. Philemon 17. So if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. Could you imagine if you were Philemon reading this, being angry? Okay, say you had a business that you owned and a worker walked off the job, stole some of your equipment, and just went on the run, or stole some of your money. And then they had the audacity to come back to you and say, you know what, I'll work again. Be like, no way. I'm calling the cops right now. Like, we've got you now. And yet Paul says, listen, Philemon, accept Onesimus as you would welcome me. See, Paul was the person that had gone to where Philemon was. Paul had shared the gospel with Philemon. He had shared the good news of Jesus and brought meaning and hope to Philemon's life. That's why he says, you owe me your very self. He says, listen, I shared with you the good news that was given to me. I put my life on the line to travel to you, to share with you the life-changing news. And no doubt Philemon looked at Paul and was so grateful, so thankful. And to look at Onesimus the way that he looked at Paul, that was a challenge. And yet this is what Paul is calling him to do. And then Paul says, Philemon, friend, if there's anything that you're owed, I'll cover it. Philemon 18 and 19, if he has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. I, Paul, am writing this with my own hand. I will pay it back, not to mention that you owe me your very self. Those are powerful words. Could you imagine if that worker that had ran away with stuff showed up to you and you said, you know what? The right thing for you to do is go back. But here, I'm going to send you with this letter, and I'm also going to send you with this blank check that you're going to give to the guy you ran away from or the lady you ran away from. And I'll cover whatever the amount is. I've got it. Paul says, whatever it is, I'll cover it. Philemon, if you need restitution, I will cover it. Could you imagine being in Onesimus' shoes during this exchange? How unworthy you would feel, how maybe guilty you would feel, and yet how encouraged and supported you would feel. That you would have Paul writing for you, covering your debt. And yet, you know why Paul was willing to do that. Because he knew that he had something even better done for him. That after dedicating his life to God and his understanding of God, and then calling for and promoting the persecution and the murder of Jesus' followers, and then realizing, oh no, the God I thought I was serving, I've actually been so against him. And realizing, wait, Jesus died for me. Paul knew that when he writes to Philemon, you owe me your very life. He's just echoing, you know what, Philemon, we both know. I owe Christ my very life. You owe Christ your very life. See, he knew Philemon knew Jesus. He's saying, if we're getting real with each other, Philemon, everything I'm saying, you know exactly where that's coming from. It's coming from Jesus. How Jesus took our guilt, took our sin, took our debts, said, you know what? I've got it covered. Because I want to restore the relationship between you and your God. And just as God stood up for Hagar in her situation, God stood up for each one of us. Jesus, being God with us, stood up for us when he went to the cross and was willing to undeservedly die to bring us life everlasting. The Apostle John wrote in one of his letters, 1 John chapter 2, verse 1, "My dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin. But if anyone does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one." As great as the best lawyer in the world could be for me, I've got Jesus advocating for me. If you place your trust, your faith in Jesus, and give him your life, he is advocating for you. As you talk to God, as you seek God's intervention, he's advocating for you. And when you find yourself at a loss for words, when maybe you have so many requests that people have shared with you, when you have so much going on in your life, and you're like, God, I don't know where to begin, I don't know what to say, I just need help. Paul, in one of his other letters, wrote this, Romans 8:26-27. "In the same way the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. He's saying, are you lost in knowing what to pray for? The Holy Spirit is interceding on your behalf. God is interceding for you in this world for God's will to come about in your life. And with such a great advocate, Paul, along with the other disciples and apostles, knew that they were being transformed to act in the way of Jesus. Which is why Paul writes this letter to Philemon. Knowing what Jesus had done for him, he says, I'm going to do this for somebody else. So I want to ask you, who is someone you could advocate for? Who is someone that you could stand up for? And it might be someone that you're like, yeah, you know what? I know exactly who you're talking about. I'm ready to do that. I was meaning to make a call or write a letter or help them cover some debts. Who do you need to advocate for? Maybe it's someone that you originally looked at and was like, ooh, they're asking for help, but they've ticked me off a little too much. What a moment, an opportunity to lean on God's wisdom and say, maybe this is a time to show grace. Who do you need to advocate for? Who can you advocate for? See, the choice to, maybe it's just somebody says something that really hurts someone and saying, you know what, I'm going to stand up and challenge that. That could begin to change someone's life. When words are said, they can hit deep. But if someone stands up and says, no, that can change the whole situation. I'm going to invite the music team to come forward, and shortly they're going to lead us in a song as our communion servers pass out communion. Because what we celebrate with communion is exactly what empowers us and pushes us to advocate for others. That we had someone who, when we were least deserving, said, I'm going to stand up for you. And if you have accepted the life-changing power of Jesus' death and resurrection, I welcome you to join with us. Take a piece of cracker and some juice and hold on to them, because we're going to take them together. We're going to take them together. Paul, ever the advocate, wrote against the actions of the Corinthian church in a letter addressed to them. Sometimes Paul wrote to encourage stuff. Sometimes he wrote to challenge or correct stuff. He said this in 1 Corinthians 11:20-22. So then when you come together, it's not the Lord's Supper you eat. For when you are eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. As a result, one person remains hungry and another gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not in this matter. See, Paul was advocating, as he talked about communion, for the least of those that would join together. This is not a place for for people to go ahead and eat when they want. People would bring tons of food and eat tons, and then others would be left hungry. Paul says, no. That is completely against what Jesus came to do. And so while we don't have a meal necessarily to celebrate communion, we will take it together. And the beauty of this communion is that each one of us, regardless of age, experiences, life circumstances, we receive it equally because of our great advocate, Jesus. So let's sing together as the emblems are passed out, and let's thank Jesus for his incredible advocacy, his incredible sacrifice.